G'day, my name's Russ Weekly from Max Design. Today is a quick demonstration of how to add borders to Bootstrap columns. On a recent Bootstrap-based site, we needed to add a border to the left side of several columns. Even though the content inside these columns could be of different heights, the borders all had to be equal height. Now, we could have used one of many JavaScript-based equal height solutions, but in this case we chose to use a pure CSS solution. Let's have a look at it and see what you think. So this is our HTML file. As well as linking off to Bootstrap, we're linking off to styles.css, where we're going to write our own styles. Down here we have a standard Bootstrap row, a class of row, and you'll see I've added a new class in here called row-relative, and we'll get back to that soon. Inside we have 3 cols, each set with the standard Bootstrap col dash. In this case we've set it to SM for small, and then -4. Now the standard Bootstrap layout allows for 12 columns, so by setting 3 columns each to 4 spans wide, we get that equal 3-column layout. Down below you'll see that 2 of them have been set with an additional class of col border, and then inside both of those columns we have an additional div with a class of col-border-padding. So here's our style sheet, and you can see I've put some base styles in here already, but we're going to write our rules under here. So we're setting a min-width of 768 for our media query. What this means is it will only kick in once the browser reaches a minimum of 768 px. Now let's add our first class. So we're using a class of col-border and then colon before, and this will create a before pseudo class selector. So we're adding the content property and we're setting the value to nothing, and that gives us the ability to style it to do whatever we want. So position absolute sets it out off the page. Top 0 and bottom 0 means it will stretch to the top and bottom of any parent container with positioning. And then we've got border-left 1px solid red. Let's go and have a look in a browser. And straight away you can see that we have a border and it's sitting on those 2 columns as we want. But there are 2 problems. The first problem is it's sitting in line with the content of those columns and not the actual edge of the column. And the second problem is that they're not of equal height. They're actually wrapping to the height of each of those individual columns. Now the reason for this is those columns have position relative attached to them, and so we actually need to turn that off and then apply it higher up the document tree. Back in our CSS file, let's write our next selector. So we're setting to padding left 0, and we're taking off the default padding within the Bootstrap columns, and we're also undoing the standard position relative and setting it back to position static. Let's go and have a look. Okay, we've got rid of our padding, but our borders are now sitting right up to the top of the whole page. So how do we address that? Well, we have to understand what absolute positioning does. We've set it to top 0 and bottom 0, so it will look for the next element with positioning up the document tree and position itself relative to that. Now if there's nothing in the document with any other positioning, it will use the viewport. So in this case it's going right up the document tree and positioning to the top and bottom of the viewport. Now what we want to do is to set it on the row above these columns, and we have a class for that called row-relative. So row-relative position and then relative. Now if we save and reload, suddenly our columns are now being positioned relative to the row rather than the viewport. Now that's getting better, and all we need to do now is to shift those 2 columns across slightly, and we can use that div inside these 2 columns to add back in some padding. Now by default, columns in Bootstrap have a padding left and right of 15 px, so we're just putting that back in on a child element inside those columns. And let's go and have a look. So suddenly now we've got our columns sitting correctly, we've got a border attached to the left of both those columns, and it will disappear when we hit small screen. However, the most important thing about this is that these columns can grow and shrink as much as needed, and because these borders are associated with a row above the columns, they'll always grow and shrink with the needs of the longest column. So there you have it, a very quick demo of how to put some borders on Bootstrap columns.